So, what are Great Britain and Keir Starmer up to again? Is this a British return to the European trough? Ladies and gentlemen, Great Britain and the European Union parted ways about 10 years ago. 10 years ago, Brexit was at its peak, and it seems that since then, the pride of Great Britain and the great British people has taken quite a beating. At the last European Union summit with Great Britain, which took place in Yerevan and also included talks with Armenia and so on, they basically concluded that Great Britain would like to belong to the European Union again, at least, and now pay attention, at least when it comes to some kind of military and economic cooperation and some coordination of investments in defense. Yeah, because they want to have access to European defense funds, and at the same time, they'd like to have access to that European initiative for the possible reconstruction of Ukraine and building up industry. For this to happen, there is a certain way that Britain could, in a roundabout way, kind of return to the European Union and get a foothold in many areas like this. But it will mean that they will have to contribute £1 billion a year to the EU budget, which is, of course, relatively little, but it's a kind of commitment, a way of showing like, yeah, look, we understand we're not in the European Union, but we want to cooperate in some way. We want to benefit from what the European Union offers, and we're willing to pay for it. The European Union, of course, is a huge market with enormous negotiating power, and even though we sometimes seem a bit comical compared to, say, China or the United States because we don't have unified leadership, a unified army, or a unified foreign policy, it's still a huge market with great strength and influence, and it can negotiate things much better than a relatively small, independent Great Britain. And Great Britain is quite afraid of this. Of great isolation, because even though after Brexit they were hoping for new opportunities, what actually followed was more of a decline for Great Britain, and Great Britain is turning into Little Britain. Yes, overall that's mainly the name of the island, but we understand what we're talking about here. Let's take a look at the economic reality of Brexit itself, and then we'll discuss whether Great Britain could come back. Besides that, we'll also cover other topics like the fall of the government in Romania or why Europe should have a stronger joint navy. So if you want to know more about Brexit, Great Britain wanting to come back, the European Navy, and of course the Romanian issue, then definitely stay here because maybe Moldova will be annexed. However, let's get to the Brexit exit. Exit Brexit. It's an event that happened several years ago. Many of you remember it. Some of you, especially the younger ones, might have it a bit hazy. But the point is that Britain felt too constrained by EU rules. They didn't like that so many foreigners were working in the European Union or from the European Union in Great Britain, that they were taking jobs from the British. And besides that, Britain also didn't like having to comply with EU regulations or, for example, not being able to have an independent fishing quota, which is something the European Union regulates quite a lot. And while Great Britain wanted it to be more relaxed, there were certain disputes, which eventually culminated in a referendum on leaving the European Union, where everyone expected the result would be to remain in the EU, but surprisingly it turned out that suddenly we're leaving the EU. So even though none of the politicians actually wanted to leave the European Union except for a few crazies, since the referendum was announced and it was binding, they had to go through with it. Britain set out on the path to leave the European Union, and it was really depressing to watch because you could just see that the politicians knew what a stupid idea it was, that everyone just wanted to use it for PR at most. Nobody actually wanted to do it. Nobody knew what to do with it. Nobody even wanted to see it through to the end. But since the referendum was binding and they had convinced the people too much, convinced them too much that they wanted to leave, suddenly they had to leave. And so Britain set out on the path to, and let's go over a few practical disadvantages that this caused. I've got a long list here, so now we're going to spend quite a bit of time with me reading you a list of everything Britain lost because of Brexit. First point, lower trade intensity and productivity. The British OBR has long estimated that Brexit has reduced the UK's long-term productivity by 4% and trade intensity by about 15%. Second point, more bureaucracy for companies trading with the European Union. Exporters deal with customs declarations, rules of origin, sanitary and phytosanitary controls, VAT, different certifications. Small companies are leaving part of the EU market because of costs and administration, a big loss, especially for Britain. Third point, worse access to the nearest and largest market. The EU is geographically the most logical trading partner. New agreements outside Europe only replace this to a limited extent. For example, CPTPP is estimated by the British to add only about 0.06% to GDP in the long term. Fourth problem, weaker investment. The OBR states that investment growth has been weaker since the referendum than was expected before 2016. The reason is, among other things, uncertainty, reduced market access, and regulatory friction. Fifth point, the problem with supply chains. Just-in-time models in automotive, food, pharmaceuticals, and chemicals are more expensive because goods no longer travel as they did within a single market. Sixth point, loss of free movement of people. The British lost the automatic right to live, study, and work in the EU. The same applies to EU citizens in the United Kingdom. In practice, this complicates recruitment, seasonal work, studying, internships, and overall mobility. Point 7. Changes in migration did not relieve the pressure on the system. EU migration has dropped significantly and net EU migration is negative. But the United Kingdom partially replaced it with migration from outside the EU, so the political goal of less migration has not been achieved for a long time, only its structure has changed. In other words, the British drove out Poles, Czechs, Hungarians, Slovaks, Croats, and similar undesirable Eastern Europeans. And they brought in educated and beautiful Algerians, Syrians, Moroccans, Nigerians, and other excellent workers who don't cause any cultural friction at all. And it's not a problem that would escalate at all. And not at all because the British right wing has solved migration absolutely brilliantly, because fewer Poles, more Africans. Exactly what every Brit wants to have. Exactly, that was sarcasm in case you missed it. Dark. But it led to a shortage of workers in some sectors, but that led to shortages mainly in care, healthcare, hospitality, agriculture, and construction. Cheaper and more flexible European labor is no longer so available. Ninth disadvantage, weaker position of London in financial services compared to the European Union. The United Kingdom has lost automatic passporting for financial services. Some activities have moved to Dublin, Paris, Frankfurt, or Amsterdam. Yes, this is quite an interesting thing that since the United Kingdom left the EU, Ireland has become incredibly wealthy. Why is that? Because there is a relatively open border between Ireland and the United Kingdom, even though Ireland is in the EU and the United Kingdom is not. And that's because there is an open border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. So basically, everyone who wants to transport goods or provide some services in Britain often does it through Ireland. And as a result, all those financial flows go through Ireland. Of course, something always stays in Ireland, so Ireland has profited disgustingly from Britain leaving the EU. Anyway, that brings us to another problem, which is the complications for Northern Ireland. A special arrangement was created between Britain, the EU, and Ireland. In practice, this means political tension, specific controls, and a long-term regulatory complication. Point 11. Exclusion from scientific and educational programs. Although the United Kingdom rejoined Horizon Europe in 2024, the gap caused by Brexit damaged cooperation, grant relationships, and trust within the scientific community. 12th point. A worse situation for some fishermen despite promises. As we said at the beginning, a big reason why the United Kingdom wanted to leave the European Union was fishing. And what did that cause? The United Kingdom got some quota increases, but the sector is small and the export of seafood to the European Union suffers from bureaucracy. Fishing and aquaculture made up only about 0.4% of the UK's economic output in 2024. To lose about 8% because of this. A percent of GDP growth and a 15% drop in trade, well, that probably wasn't very advantageous, was it? 13th point. Less influence on EU rules, which the United Kingdom still often has to respect anyway. British companies selling to the European Union have to comply with EU standards, but the United Kingdom can no longer take part in making those rules. That's probably one of the worst things because they were talking about wanting to be sovereign. Well, their trade became a bit more sovereign in the sense that if they want to trade with the European Union, they still have to follow the EU's rules, but now they can't help create or shape them anymore. That really paid off. That's known as the Brussels effect, which applies worldwide. Basically, when the European Union regulates something, most of those regulations end up spreading around the world because everyone wants to trade with the European Union since that's where the money is, right? Therefore, the effect naturally worked on the United Kingdom as well, which is economically heavily tied to the European Union. So, yeah, great job, United Kingdom. Trade still has to operate according to the rules of the European Union, but now the United Kingdom can't have a say in them anymore. Amazing, and that's exactly what will happen to any country that wants to leave the EU. And of course, higher political and regulatory uncertainty. Companies have to plan according to the relationship between the European Union and the United Kingdom, which keeps changing. Even attempts to reset relations with the EU run into the issues of payments and rules for access to the single market. So these are the disadvantages that Brexit has caused for the United Kingdom. As you can see, the list is massive and it's long. And the list is really brutal for the economy and actually for the whole of Britain. As for the advantages, basically the main advantage is that Great Britain can make its own decisions pretty much entirely on its own. To some extent, that's both a disadvantage and an advantage. It's hard to say, because if you make your own decisions but still do it wrong and it harms you, then you haven't really gained much from it. Sure, you can point to the fishermen, but favoring fishing and fisheries at the expense of a brutal decline in trade and becoming poorer isn't really a logical path. Of course, you can mention things like the fact that Great Britain could respond much more flexibly on the world stage in its foreign policy and in imposing sanctions and so on. Sure, but Great Britain could impose sanctions even if it were part of the European Union, just as it pleases. And even now, when sanctions are being imposed or diplomatic steps are being taken against Russia, Great Britain usually cooperates either with the European Union or with a number of countries from the European Union. So, in the end, if you look at it, the only ones who benefited from Great Britain's departure from the European Union are some influencers and politicians who built their campaigns and careers on it. And Ireland. Ireland also profited quite a lot from it. Otherwise, it was an absolutely terrible fiasco for the United Kingdom, and so it's really no wonder that they might want to consider returning to the European Union, or at least try to get involved with the EU a little, for example, by wanting access through fees to the defense funds, recovery funds, and economic initiatives, for example, in Ukrainian territory. Now, you might be asking whether it's possible for Great Britain to return to the European Union now that British pride has taken a hit and most of British society thinks that leaving the EU was a mistake and that it might actually be nice to stay in the EU or theoretically return there. The return is complicated because, of course, there are certain criteria that have to be met, like economic criteria, rule of law, and things like that. Great Britain would probably be able to meet those. That would be fine. But at the same time, everyone in the European Union would have to agree that Great Britain can return. And honestly, I don't think everyone in the European Union would agree. Firstly, the return of Great Britain would significantly weaken the position of France and Germany, because even though Great Britain would want to return, since the EU is more advantageous, etc., it would still remain somewhat distant and would most likely act as a counterbalance to France and Germany. That means that at least in France and Germany, there would be a strong reason and strong motivation to keep Great Britain out of the EU. Besides that, if we look at it a bit idealistically, many countries or some representatives might say something like it would set a precedent, meaning that suddenly anyone could leave and rejoin whenever they feel like it. Oh, no, the membership of a state in the European Union wouldn't be a commitment, it wouldn't be a relationship that starts and possibly ends and that's it, but it would actually be a situationship between states, which we don't need and most likely the European Union wouldn't need either. Yeah, the European Union can't start acting like a tram where anyone can just get on and off whenever it suits them. That could really mess up the EU. So for that reason, I think the return of the United Kingdom in the foreseeable future, say in the next 5 years, is very unlikely. And the United Kingdom would really have to prove a lot that it would actually stay in the European Union for us to take it back. Maybe it would even have to be arranged so that the European Union would have to sign some kind of agreement with the United Kingdom, where the UK would give up its right to leave and would just have to stay in the EU, probably forever. Yeah, like Homer Simpson at the nuclear plant or something. So that's the problem here, and that's what's currently being dealt with in Europe and in Britain. Of course, there are still other things here. Let's take a look at what else is happening. First of all, Europe needs a navy. This is more of a military matter, and it's related to the military because the era of free shipping lanes is somewhat behind us, and we're seeing a bit of an epidemic where various people and groups want to charge fees for different maritime straits. And we're not just talking about Hormuz and Iran, we're also talking about the Houthis, who would like to control and charge fees for the Red Sea, which would obviously hurt Europe because a huge amount of its trade flows through the Red Sea. But it's not just about the Houthis, it's also about Indonesia, because Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world, as you surely know, and its finance minister even remarked somewhat jokingly that it wouldn't be a bad idea to start charging fees for passage through the Strait of Malacca. The Strait of Malacca is one of the most important places for global trade. Tens of percent of goods for the European Union and Europe as a whole flow through there, and charging fees for it would, of course, complicate trade in a really brutal way. And for that reason, because various idiots are starting to act up and various idiots are starting to feel that free shipping lanes are some kind of idea that shouldn't apply and that free shipping lanes aren't good and they'd like to start charging for them, Europe should have the power to enforce these free shipping lanes, because a free shipping lane is simply the holy grail of global trade. And even though for us in the Czech Republic, a free shipping lane might not mean that much since we're lousy landlocked rats, for maritime nations, the idea of free navigation is an extremely important thing. And for that reason, I would say that Europe, which has such vast seas and such a huge coastline, yes, one of the longest coastlines on the planet, I even think Europe might have the longest coastline overall because of how it's curved and so on. So given how we're set up like this, we should simply have a strong navy and we should have a strong influence over the control of shipping routes and enforcing that they remain free. We need to have strength and we must be able to do much more than just appeal to some kind of law, some kind of legislation or international organizations. In the worst case, we have to be able to simply bomb anyone who starts blocking any ships. Yeah, if there's no other way. So that's the argument. Basically, it's a quick message that we need to keep the shipping lanes open. And to keep the shipping lanes open, we need a strong, maybe not the strongest, maybe European, maybe a joint navy, but definitely a strong navy of European countries. The Americans won't do it for us because they are weak. So, and now to what's happening in Romania, because that's something that also concerns the European Union. The Romanian parliament has voted no confidence in the government, leading to tough talks about forming a new one. The government has fallen. Why did this happen? The government. It fell because the socialists are leaving the government, because the government tried to reduce the budget deficit and tried to slow down the increase of debt. Basically, you could say that the exact opposite of what is happening right now in the Czech Republic happened there. But there, unlike our motorist party, the local left-wing party has some backbone. So while our right wing has no backbone, the Romanian left does. They have backbone. And based on that, the government was brought down. At this moment, however, early elections are not expected. Rather, new negotiations for a new government coalition are expected. Well, we'll see how it all turns out. What is probably the most interesting about this is the rise in popularity of the party called Alliance for the Unity of Romanians. That is, Alianța pro Sjednocenie Rumunsko. And this alliance has gained enormous popularity over the past 2 years. When you look at it, since the last election when they got 18% right now in pre-election polls or overall political surveys, they are absolutely dominant and have 35%. What is the Alliance for the Unity of Romanians? The Alliance for the Unity of Romanians is a right-wing nationalist party, Eurosceptic in nature, that wants to unify Romania. What does it mean to unify Romania? It means to acquire Moldova and Transnistria. Overall, the party is somewhat complicated. It is strongly anti-Russian. It is strongly anti-Russian in the sense that Transnistria is a problem and the Soviets stole Moldova from them and so on. Very often, their leaders make critical remarks about Moscow, but at the same time, there are leaders who are very, very hostile toward Ukraine. Basically, you could say that this party is very similar in terms of rhetoric, national sentiment, and approach to the economy. Actually, in their approach to certain values, national values, and so on. So it is very similar, for example, to TISA in Hungary. Yeah. So they are Eurosceptic, but they are also anti-growth, and at the same time they are anti-Ukrainian and against helping Ukraine and these kinds of things. Therefore, if they won the elections, it would probably mean that we would get a Romanian-Hungary in the European Union, and that Romanian-Hungary would be Hungary actually in Peter Magyar's mold. To that, you should probably add a bit more intense nationalism and a few more real plans for some kind of expansion or unification of Romania and that kind of enthusiasm. At the same time, if this party were to win, considering Peter Magyar's attitude toward Hungarians abroad and the territories that used to belong to Hungary, they probably wouldn't get along at all. Because, of course, when you have a party for a unified Romania that wants to unite, it's probably not going to be the biggest ally of a party that says, for the rights of all Hungarians around the world, which also means for the rights of Romanian Hungarians. Well, it's also going to be interesting in Romania. Overall, things aren't calming down at all in Eastern Europe. At this moment, it doesn't look like there will be early elections, but still, there will be another election in 2 years. And this leadership of AUR, the Alliance for the Unity of Romania, looks like the next leader of the country. It looks like the next leadership of the country. And if this wins, not only will the European Union have a new thorn in its side, but it will also be very interesting on the shores of the Black Sea. What will happen? And considering that right now Moldova is starting its own initiative to get Transnistria back, for example, by banning travel there and so on, and we know that, of course, you can't travel through Ukraine, Moldova's efforts to regain Transnistria are currently escalating quite a bit. They're really picking up. And if Romania also starts trying to get Moldova back, because as you surely know, Moldova is former Romanian territory, they took it, and a special Moldovan Republic was created there, then things could get very, very tense and very, very dramatic. Anyway, in conclusion, what can we say about what's happening in Europe? In Europe, we need a navy. Britain is getting closer again. The Romanian government has collapsed, and it's going to be tough. We'll see each other again next time. Please let me know in the comments which of these news stories from the European Union interested you the most, what resonated with you the most. Of course, the main topic was Brexit and Britain's return to the European Union and so on, but I'd say these Romanian and naval topics are also very interesting, and maybe we could talk about them a bit more in depth sometime. What do you think? Hey, in any case, we'll see each other again sometime on the stream. For those of you watching the recordings, come join the streams. We'll definitely see each other in more videos. For now, subscribe, share, like, and give some visibility with that little star that pops up after you like. And of course, leave a comment with your opinion on these topics. And if you can't do anything else, you can always send money through the QR code to support this independent, if not journalistic, then definitely news content. So that's it. Have a great day and see you later.